The silence when Julian packed was louder than any screaming match we had ever had. He stood in the middle of our bedroom, stuffing bespoke shirts into a leather duffel bag, the kind of expensive luggage a man buys when he wants his betrayal to look chic, and he looked at me, waiting for the performance. He waited for the tears, the pleading, the inevitable female collapse that would validate his choice to leave for a woman 10 years younger who offered less history and more novelty. But the tears never came. I watched him, and the only thing I felt was a cold, surgical detachment. It wasn't pain. It was the sudden, shocking realization that the man I had built a life with was an architectural sketch built on sand, and now that he was abandoning the blueprint, I was finally free to dismantle the faulty foundation. He interpreted my stillness as shock, perhaps even catatonia. "Clara, please. Don't make this harder than it has to be. We can handle the assets cleanly," he said, his voice laced with the full compassion of a man managing a logistical problem, not ending a 20-year marriage. I didn't respond. I just nodded once, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, and in that instant, I knew exactly what I needed to do. While he planned his future weekend getaways and romantic vineyard trips with his new muse, I would be sitting at my desk, quietly charting the coordinates of his financial destruction. He had spent years telling me I was too soft, too emotional, too focused on the hearth. He was about to discover that the quiet woman he took for granted had been paying attention to every single detail he overlooked, every contractual loophole, and every thread of risk woven into the fabric of his supposedly brilliant career. The dismantling had begun the moment he walked out the door, and the first step was pulling up the shared business ledger. Julian's arrogance was my greatest asset. He treated me like a decorative piece of furniture that had suddenly stopped matching the new wallpaper. He called a week later, suggesting a mediator, assuring me he wanted to be fair. His definition of fair, of course, involved him keeping the lion's share of the liquid assets to fund his startup firm, while I retained the responsibility for the mortgage on the large, illiquid house. He needed capital to impress his new partner, Sarah, and he expected me to be the easily placated martyr. I played the part perfectly. My voice was small, shaky, and I agreed to his initial terms, throwing in a few sniffles for good measure when discussing the trauma. This confirmed his assumption that I was broken and incapable of fighting back. What he didn't know was that while he was busy scouting beachfront properties with Sarah, properties he planned to leverage against our marital assets, I was deep in the digital archives of his company. For years, Julian had used a complicated system of intermingled personal and business accounts, a common practice among egotistical entrepreneurs who believe transparency is for the weak. I, the simple wife he dismissed, had quietly managed the administrative side of his firm for the first 10 years of our marriage before shifting to part-time consulting. I knew exactly where the skeletons were buried, which funds were improperly classified, and which future project contracts were based on shaky verbal guarantees. The house was his primary leverage point, the symbol of his success, and that was the first domino I needed to secure against him. Julian's memory was as selective as his ethical compass. When we bought our home, a beautiful but monstrously expensive Victorian, he insisted on the narrative that he, the visionary architect, had secured the financing. What he conveniently forgot, or chose to ignore, was the significant inheritance I received from my grandmother 3 years ago. At the time, Julian had pressured me to invest the lump sum directly into his firm to stabilize cash flow during a risky merger attempt. I had refused, citing a vague need for personal security, a move he resented deeply. Instead, I quietly allocated 90% of that inheritance, nearly $400,000, specifically toward paying down the principal of our mortgage, structuring the payments so they were not obvious to Julian, who only glanced at the monthly summary. This didn't just reduce our debt. It dramatically increased my established equity claim, and crucially, the source of those funds was entirely separate property, shielded from his business debts. I spent a week with a forensic accountant, not a divorce lawyer yet, simply ensuring every single transaction was documented, indexed, and notarized. When Julian's lawyer eventually asked for the breakdown of the marital home equity, they would find a spreadsheet detailing that the vast majority of the equity growth in the last 3 years stemmed directly from my separate funds. It wasn't petty revenge. It was preemptive self-preservation, ensuring that when I signed the final decree, I would walk away with my future housing secured, while he would be left scratching his head over how his grand assets suddenly became a modest claim. The real fragility in Julian's life wasn't financial, it was professional. His firm, Architeuthis Design, was entirely dependent on 2 things: his massive ego and one colossal client, Apex Corporate Holdings. Apex supplied 70% of his annual revenue, and Julian treated their contracts with cavalier disregard, believing his genius excused any contractual sloppiness. He often pushed deadlines, substituted cheaper materials without formal approval, and, most damningly, had a history of misclassifying contractor payments to minimize tax liabilities on major builds, all the sort of corner-cutting that provides speed and profit until an audit comes knocking. I didn't need to hire a private investigator. I just needed access to the external hard drive he kept tucked behind his desk, the one he thought was secured with a password based on our wedding anniversary, a password he hadn't changed since year 5. I copied everything: emails detailing the cost-cutting measures, internal memos discussing liability waivers, and the thinly veiled correspondence where Julian subtly bullied subcontractors. My background wasn't in law, but 6 years working as a high-level paralegal before marriage taught me one fundamental truth: documentation is destiny. I didn't intend to leak this information to the public or even to the IRS. That would be messy, expensive, and emotionally draining. I intended to deliver it to the one place it would do the most immediate, irreparable damage: Apex Corporate Holdings' own legal department. I knew that Julian wasn't just losing a wife, he was about to lose the life support system of his entire professional identity. Julian was growing impatient with the slow pace of a separation. He started dropping hints about moving Sarah into a new, trendy downtown loft, a clear sign that he was leveraging future earnings and assumed equity from our house to fund his new lifestyle. This was the moment for the biggest maneuver, the one that required impeccable timing and absolute legal silence. We owned a small cabin property upstate, purchased a decade ago as an investment. Julian always viewed it as a nuisance, something I managed and rented out minimally, generating passive income. He thought of it as a low-value asset, maybe worth $200,000 in the final settlement, which he was happy to concede to me as a consolation prize. But I had been watching the local real estate market meticulously and knew that the adjacent land had just been rezoned for commercial development, quietly skyrocketing the cabin's value overnight to over $750,000. Before the official appraisal for the divorce could be conducted, I worked with my independent lawyer, one Julian knew nothing about, to swiftly transfer the property into an irrevocable trust, naming myself and a future charity focused on women's financial literacy as beneficiaries. This was done using a clause in our original joint tenancy agreement and utilizing the separate funds I had documented earlier. It was clean, legal, and completely protected from the marital asset pool before the valuation date. When Julian finally got wind of the formal appraisal request, he would discover an asset he thought was minor was gone, protected, and worth far more than he ever imagined. The question is, where is the line between protecting oneself and delivering a justified consequence? When a partner breaks a fundamental covenant like marriage, do they forfeit the right to be protected from the fallout of their own recklessness? I truly want to know your thoughts on this. Let me know in the comments below. What would you have protected first? The calm broke exactly 6 weeks later. It wasn't the trust transfer that tipped him off. Julian rarely checked the property tax records. It was the phone call from the bank. Because his firm relied heavily on credit facilities backed by collateral tied to our jointly owned assets, the sudden, strategic separation of my funds from the primary mortgage payments and the disappearance of the cabin from the easily leverageable pool had triggered a significant margin requirement warning. Julian called me screaming, something he hadn't done since the day he left. His voice was frantic, demanding to know what I had done to the lines of credit. He sounded less like an injured husband and more like a cornered broker whose portfolio was evaporating. "I haven't done anything to your credit, Julian," I said, my voice measured and completely devoid of emotion. "I've simply secured my own financial standing, as any responsible adult would do when faced with an imminent divorce." He accused me of sabotage. "You're trying to ruin me!" he shrieked. I paused, letting the silence stretch across the line. "Ruin you, Julian? You already did that yourself the moment you decided to leverage a life we built together for a fling. I am merely ensuring I don't go down with your sinking ship." It was then that I dropped the truth that completely stole his breath. "I've known about Sarah for 8 months, Julian. Not since you told me last month. I've known since last winter. I've simply been preparing for your departure." The silence on his end was the sound of a man realizing his narrative of the wronged, unsuspecting wife had been a dangerous fantasy. He hung up, but the panic in his voice confirmed that my quiet, calculated effort was finally drawing blood. The real checkmate came 3 days after his frantic call. This was the moment I had spent 2 years of quiet observation and 6 months of calculated action preparing for. I hired a specialized courier service, anonymous and untraceable, to deliver a meticulously prepared binder to the managing partner and the general counsel of Apex Corporate Holdings. The binder contained everything: scanned copies of Julian's internal memos, cross-reference spreadsheets detailing material substitutions on 3 separate, high-value contracts, and the correspondence proving Julian knowingly skirted local building codes to meet aggressive deadlines. It was professionally assembled, damning, and critically, it was impossible to trace back to me directly. I wasn't seeking revenge through public spectacle. I was seeking professional accountability through corporate risk management. Apex didn't care about Julian's marital affairs, but they cared deeply about liability. By the end of the week, Julian's main line of credit was frozen, and he received a terse, 2-sentence email. Apex Corporate Holdings was immediately terminating all current and future contracts with Architeuthis Design due to unforeseen contractual irregularities and exposure to potential legal risk. 70% of his revenue gone. His empire, built on the assumption of indispensable genius, vanished with the click of a send button. He lost the money, but more importantly, he lost the reputation that underpinned his entire self-worth. That evening, he showed up at the house, unannounced, expecting me to gloat. I was simply watering the orchids, utterly unmoved. Julian paced our living room, his face flushed and his expensive suit rumpled, a visual representation of the implosion of his professional life. He blamed everyone: the lawyers, the bank, the market, and especially me. He didn't even mention Sarah, which spoke volumes about what he truly valued. His panic was infectious, but I remained immune. He demanded I tell him what I did, how I managed to orchestrate such a professional disaster. I looked up from my orchid, my hands still covered in potting soil, and said, "You did it, Julian. I just cleared the path for the inevitable consequences of your decisions." His grandiose plan to move into the waterfront condo with Sarah completely disintegrated. The bank refused to release funds, citing the sudden and massive default risk posed by the loss of the Apex contracts. Sarah, the woman Julian had romanticized as his fresh start, began to see the true nature of the man, not the successful, charming architect, but the indebted, volatile liability. Their relationship, built on the shifting sands of Julian's perceived wealth, couldn't withstand the chill of financial reality. I heard through mutual friends that the arguments were now public, shrill, and entirely focused on money. The young woman, who was supposed to be the prize of his new life, was quickly becoming the auditor of his failures. While Julian was fighting to salvage his relationship and his firm, I was reviewing the final settlement papers, making sure every detail of my future, my equity, my retirement funds, my stability was airtight. The final meeting with the mediator was anticlimactic. Julian arrived looking haggard, having aged 10 years and 6 months. His lawyer, a sharp-suited woman who now wore a perpetually defeated expression, did most of the talking, primarily listing the assets Julian no longer possessed or couldn't access. Julian had expected a brutal, protracted battle over every cent, a chance to unleash the fury he had suppressed. Instead, I presented a clean, comprehensive settlement that allocated all significant debt to him, debt he incurred through leveraging his business after he had left the marital home, protected my personal assets completely, and provided him with a respectable, though heavily mortgaged, secondary residence that he had initially planned to rent out for profit. He walked away with the title to his bankrupt firm, the responsibility for its outstanding liabilities, and enough liquidity to start over, provided he was willing to truly start small. It was a fair settlement, devastating only because he had calculated his worth based on inflated expectations. He looked at the paperwork, then at me, searching for the triumphant smirk, the tearful bitterness, the sign that I was savoring his fall. But I gave him nothing. I simply signed the documents with a steady hand. He finally asked the question he should have asked 6 months ago. Why, Clara? Why didn't you just fight me like a normal person? Why this cold, calculated destruction? I didn't offer him the satisfaction of an explanation, just the truth of my emotional vacancy. There was nothing left to fight for, Julian, and I refused to be collateral damage in your crisis. I didn't cry when he left because the process of preparing for his exit had drained every last drop of sentiment I possessed. The 6 months I spent meticulously dismantling his financial architecture were not about revenge. They were an exercise in radical self-rescue. I wasn't erasing him from my history, but rather erasing the catastrophic future he had tried to drag me into. The pain of the betrayal had been converted, molecule by molecule, into clarity and decisiveness. I realized that the true tragedy wasn't his infidelity, but the sheer predictability of his failure. Julian had always been his own greatest liability, and I simply stopped trying to mitigate his risk. A year later, I am in that Victorian home, now fully mine, financially stable, and I have found a quiet, profound sense of peace. The house is no longer a symbol of our shared ambition. It is a monument to my resilience. Healing isn't always messy and loud. Sometimes it's quiet, disciplined, and utterly ruthless in its focus on self-preservation. I found my strength not in confronting him, but in completely disconnecting from his chaos. The only thing left of Julian now is a signed piece of paper affirming my freedom, and that I realize is worth more than all the money in the world. Thanks everyone for watching. If you liked this, please subscribe to the channel Femme Fatale Files, leave a like, and write in the comments which country you are from. Stay tuned, there will be a new story tomorrow.